Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to part 2 of our segment on abortion. And if you recall from our first lesson, our first hour together, we spent a lot of time looking at quotes against abortion or that question or challenge abortion, primarily from women's voices, oftentimes from progressive women's voices. And we raised an interesting question, I think, one that in the politics of abortion doesn't get raised very often. Why do we not consider abortion, the protection of the most vulnerable, the most unable to speak for themselves, the unborn? In any other constituency group, in any other argument, the radical left would be on the side, theoretically, of these individuals, of these unborn people, especially when you think about the tremendous toll abortion takes on minority babies. Just go back to 2012 in New York City, Manhattan. More babies were actually aborted, black babies were actually aborted in Manhattan, New York City, in 2012 than were born alive. When we think about the eugenic premises of many of the founders of abortion, we're going to talk about that today, how the movement toward abortion, the legalization of abortion in the early 20th century all the way through Roe versus Wade in 1973 had at its core a core group of feminist, early prototypical feminist thinkers who were quite racist and nasty in the reasons they wanted abortion. They wanted abortion, people like Margaret Sanger, to particularly restrict the growth of undesirable races and elements within society. You think about the progressive left's rhetoric with regards to minorities, with regards to those who have no voice, with regards to those who are vulnerable culturally and politically. And it's interesting how quickly that gets completely twisted into its opposite when it comes to unborn children. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to focus on how, in those quotes we read from you last time, Alveda King and others, it's a human rights issue, isn't it? This is not simply a women's right issue. It's a human right issue. And in the broader capacity of human rights, it's interesting how the subset of women's rights seems to unproblematically for the left trump their rhetoric in all these other areas. And so if we look as a way of carrying forward where we left off last time, let's carry the history of abortion into the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century. Let's carry it into the American sphere. As early as 1821, states like Connecticut were beginning to ban abortions at certain periods in time. We should understand, too, in colonial America, as throughout history, abortion was something that was done. It was not collective. It was not part of the medical establishment necessarily. It was done by midwives. It was done by desperate women. It was done in ways that, while regrettably people thought was necessary, it was never really formally sanctioned. It was not something it was always, in other words, it was always more or less an underground procedure. And that was true in America in the colonial period. It apparently didn't seem to happen all that often, but it was never state sanctioned. 1821, Connecticut actually took steps to ban abortions by poisoning after quickening. The quickening, as we mentioned at the end of the last hour, the quickening was this argument that when a child in the womb displayed vitality or took on the characteristics of life, utterly impossible to define, especially in cultures where sonograms and x-rays and such were completely impossible. This idea of the quickening was wholly made up. It was the idea that life was protected from the moment that the child quickened. And in Connecticut, as early as 1821, bans on abortion by poisoning. It was really a very dangerous thing that these abortions took place after the child had quickened by poisoning the baby and by extension poisoning to some degree the mother. These procedures were banned as early as 1821. By 1856, the American Medical Association was absolutely front and center in campaigning to make all abortions illegal. That's a really remarkable, when we think about where modern medicine is headed today, it's a remarkable thing to think about. In the 19th century, the American Medical Association was almost unilateral in its condemnation of abortion. Move forward. 1873, you get the Comstock Act. This is a very important, seemingly not all that relevant, but very important initiative. 1873, the American Medical Association supported the Comstock Act, and the Comstock Act basically banned all mailing of information and advertising for abortion heading through the U.S. postal system. The idea that you could, you think about it as banning cigarette ads today from TV, or banning alcohol ads advertising on TV during certain primetime hours where kids might be watching. The Comstock Act sought to do something very similar in 1873 with mail. Abortion providers could not simply mail direct mailing, so to speak, or advertisements for abortion procedures in the mail. That was 1873. Why is that going to be such a big deal? Because when Roe versus Wade is overturned exactly 100 years to the year after the Comstock Act, privacy, the idea of a woman's right to privacy, is going to factor into this, and we'll see that coming up in a moment. 1875, in her speech, social purity feminist Susan B. Anthony also condemned abortion. And it is interesting, we mentioned this last time as well, some of the early suffragettes, some of the pioneers of women's voting rights and the right of women to have autonomy and the right to be equal before the law, many of these suffragettes also recognized in abortion a tremendous overreach in the destruction of babies, particularly by mothers. When mothers were compelled by society or social convention, or mothers had husbands who were either illegitimate or wicked and were compelled into situations of abortion. The feminist suffragettes seem universally to decry this, as they should have. But it is important to realize that the earliest wave of, we think of first wave feminism, let's call this pre-first wave feminism, which was actually much more mother-friendly and was very concerned about the rights of mothers before babies were born and what to do with them after they were born. The idea of abortion was not something that many of our founding feminist women, if you will, saw as a viable option. 1875, Susan B. Anthony, in her famous speech, Social Purity, actually condemns abortions or aspects in the context that give rise to abortion. Here's what she wrote in part. Guilty. Speaking of abortion, guilty. Yes, no matter what the motive, be it the love of ease or the desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life. It will burden her soul in death. But oh, thrice guilty is he who, for selfish gratification, heedless of her prayers, indifferent to her fate, drove her to the desperation which impels her to the crime. Now, this is a really interesting little statement. We should take a moment or two and parse it. Guilty. Where does the guilt fall for this? And I think it is a perfectly fair thing to say that absent fathers, that casual sex, that unreliable men, that brutal men, ununderstanding men have contributed much, obviously, to the rise of abortion, the legalization of abortion. The funny thing is, though, once abortion got legalized, you were almost going to guarantee that male behavior with regards to sexuality got better, not worse. When we libertined the culture further, when we elevated sex and sexual experience above commitment, trust, love, and ultimately marriage, we're going to see in a moment how that did not really benefit men, which did not benefit women in the long run. But if you go back to the quote from Susan B. Anthony, where does the guilt lie? Yes, no matter what the motive of an abortion. And I love that she's blunt about this. Love of ease, comfort, or maybe the desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent. I just love that. It is not a fetus. It is an unborn innocent. It is a living thing. It is a human living life. Susan B. Anthony is 100% correct about that. It is a human living life that just hasn't been born. It is innocent in its abilities. It's innocent in its nature, which means it is not guilty of anything. It has done nothing to warrant this lack of protection for it. And the comfort, right? Whether the motive for the abortion is love of ease, to make the woman's life easier, or the desire, perhaps misguided, to save from any potential suffering the unborn innocent, the idea that we must prohibit certain individuals from being born because their life will be a burden to us, or their medical care or their conditions are such that they will not have the quality of life that we think is normal. I mentioned, I believe, last time what's going on in places like Iceland, where you have countries now in Europe boasting that thanks to the technology and progress of modern medicine, they are allowing no Down syndrome babies to be born whatsoever. Iceland boasted, tiny little European country, that no Down syndrome babies were born in the last year, which means that whenever mothers became pregnant and sonograms suggested, the possibility, even where we ended last time's show, even the possibility that there would be a potential for Down syndrome was enough to convince mothers at the urging of medical personnel in the government to abort that baby. And of course, we know that you're not just aborting Down syndrome babies, because it was almost never a situation where it was a 100% guarantee or a 90% guarantee of Down syndrome. These were much lower numbers. That was enough to spur this. So not only are you destroying a kind of genocide against Down syndrome people, whom we all know, we recognize that Down syndrome people live productive lives. They have feelings and emotions. They're able to carry on complicated human relationships. They are people of faith. They are people of hard work. They are people of good cheer, as often as the rest of us are. And so to prohibit them from being born, and the babies that would not have been born with Down syndromes had they been allowed to be carried to full term, what are we doing here in the name of some kind of a normalizing of certain levels of intellectual and developmental purity? Is this really something we should be engaged in? And you ask yourself the question, this kind of genocide, this kind of killing to prevent illness. Go back to the Susan B. Anthony quote, please. This idea that maybe we are going to destroy babies in the womb to save them from suffering, these unborn innocent. In any way you frame this, she said, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. And I think that's wonderfully frank. The culpability of the woman in the destruction of her baby is paramount. And what are the reasons for it? We know that, culturally, ideas of rape and incest and something that would greatly detrimentally affect the woman's health, kill the mother potential. There's almost nobody, including most religious traditions, that would have a problem with the possibility of abortion in those cases. But we're not talking about that, and Susan B. Anthony is very specific. She says, in the love of ease or the desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life. That's back before we convinced women, particularly young women, that not only was there something to be burdened by the decision, that it was a kind of feminist liberation. This kind of playing with words that the progressive second and third wave feminists engage into this day. It's not murder, because it never was a baby, and it never was a human life. And not only is it not murder because it never was a baby and it never was a human life, it is simply a parasite. It is simply something that is a completely subordinate to you. I was in my own university classroom not too long ago, and the question of these issues came up. We were reading the Gospels. We were talking about Christ's compassion for the weak and the sick. I send you out, Jesus said, as sheep among the wolves, that this idea there is no greater love than to lay down your life for another. This idea of sacrificial love that is at the heart of Christianity. It's a wonderful philosophy as well as a compelling religious narrative. And we were talking about this in class, and I had one student who was very articulate about how we absolutely needed to protect the weak and the sick, how absolutely it fell to us as well human beings, fully in our faculties, to sacrifice for the weaker, the poorer. We must provide for them. We must preserve their life. We must adopt. Well, she wasn't a Christian, but she understood the moral and philosophical appeal of Christ's words. And she spoke really, really rather eloquently about the defense of the most vulnerable and the voiceless. And so recognizing in this, we had talked a little bit earlier about infanticide. I said, so would you then also support a ban on abortion? And it was amazing how quickly her countenance changed. She went from being compassionate, loving, embracing, sensitive, to immediate rage. She basically spluttered out, no, I would not. Because an unborn child, a fetus in her words, is nothing but a parasite. That's the way she described it. It was something like a tick or a tumor or a tapeworm that fed and depleted her resources. And that as far as she was concerned, a human baby wasn't born until it was outside of her, until it had left her body. And then I followed up with an obvious question. It was an interesting discussion. I asked her, well, what separates the 6-week-old baby from the 8.5-month-old baby, other than it's separate from your body? The idea is that if it's an inconvenience for the mother to carry that baby, if it is a parasite who requires her blood or her food or her oxygen to live, well, isn't it more of a burden outside? And progressives have made this argument. Think about the arguments of Peter Singer, the chair of the philosophy department, the infamous chair of the philosophy department at Princeton University, who makes similar arguments. There's a certain logic to them. If that's how we determine life, that the mother is 100% control of when it's a child and when it's not, at her whim, then Is an 8.5-month-old baby in the mother's womb really all that different from a 6-week-old baby out of it? The argument certainly can be made that a 6-week-old baby outside of the mother's womb requires extraordinary effort on mom or dad or parents to feed it, to clothe it, to clean it, to look after it in ways that in utero it didn't have to happen. As the mother ate, the child ate. As the mother expelled her waste, the baby's waste was expelled. As the mother breathed, the child was able to breathe as well. And so all of these things then correspondingly ask the question, with all of the added burden of the child after it's born, and Peter Singer has a certain devastating logic here. If you can abort a baby at 6 months or 8 months or 7 months in the mother's womb, why can't you abort it at 6, 7, 8 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years after it's born? After all, what do we require by way of human agency? A 2-year-old child can no more take care of itself than an 8.5-month-old baby can. And the mother and the burden on those around it becomes greater. And so I was really taken aback by the argument in class that on the one hand, and this is the point that I was trying to make in episode 1, that very sensitive people who are very, very keen on civil rights and social justice don't extend that to arguably the most vulnerable demographic that we have in the world at any given time, those who are developing and who are unborn. And so there's this very draconian sense that until, in her mind anyway, until that child sees the light of day and departs her body with her goodwill and nothing else, then that can't be considered anything like an abortion. It is merely a procedure, a medical procedure. If you go back to what Susan B. Anthony says here, guilty, yes, she says. And I love the framing of this, guilt and innocence. These are moral questions. These are human questions. They are not feminist questions. They are not questions of simply bodily reality. They are not questions that Susan B. Anthony lays out here. They are not simply questions of right of control or organistic dominance. They are questions of morality and ethics and virtue and love behind them. Guilty, yes. No matter what motive you come up with, from love of ease or the misguided desire to euthanize to pre-euthanize babies, so to speak, to stop them from suffering from being born into a world because of some disability, because of some developmental problem, or simply because the world's a miserable place. Maybe we euthanize them now instead of mercy killing, we'll have to come up with another word, right? Euthanization is the killing of those, mercy killing, those who are suffering in the world. What if we retroactively apply that word? Right? And you see this idea, this desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent. The woman is not just guilty, Susan B. Anthony says. She is awfully guilty who commits the deed. And I don't quibble with her second point. This will burden her conscience and her life. This will burden her soul in death. Boy, these are two metaphysical angles that civil rights is genuinely concerned with, right? Social justice, civil rights, human rights. All of the things that the atheist radical abort left says they're concerned about. Whose rights, right? The conscience in life, our conscientious life, our souls in death, but oh, those things will burden her, but oh, thrice guilty is he, the third part of the statement, who for selfish gratification and heedless of her prayers, indifferent to her fate, drove her to the desperation which compels her to the crime. It is a crime. It's a crime against humanity. We think about the horrible experiments that Hitler and the Japanese, for that matter, did on infants and the unborn, did on baby twins when they were born. This horrible mutilation, this treating of living human babies as nothing more than an extension of the fetus, right? Babies that were born to Jewish women were not treated as living things. They were disposed of and tormented and tortured and experimented on in the same way that we treat unborn babies as parasites or just cells or clumps of developing tissue. It is remarkable when we think about that. We have a tremendous amount of moral outrage for what happened in the Holocaust, as we should. But there is a genocide that has not stopped in Western culture since World War II, as Europe came to legalize abortion much quicker than America did. And so you see how these parameters here, but you go back again to Susan B. Anthony to talk about this. But thrice guilty is that man who, whether he be father or lover or the person who simply impregnated the woman, thrice guilty is he who, for his own selfish gratification or to extrapolate him from a difficult situation with his own wife or his own family or his own social connections, heedless of her prayers, indifferent to her fate, drove her to the desperation that impels her to that crime. Guilty begins this statement, crime ends it. And morality is all throughout it. If we look back at those issues again that social justice-minded liberals say trump reason, trump reality, trump economics, these ideas, right, that should make us compassionate and feeling. Liberalism is, of course, a worldview, progressivism, that is predicated on feelings. And what's hard to understand about this is these virtue signaling, these feelings of justice and equality and equity and tolerance that the leftists continually preaches to us, that when it comes to these unborn children, it is nowhere to be found. It is the exact opposite. And I think that's why I think Susan Anthony hits it on the head. If you start to consider a baby, a developing baby, as a human, as the human being that it is, then we have to afford it rights. And according to the progressive left's own way of doing things, the more vulnerable, the more absolute moral authority we convey. The more vulnerable, the more discriminated against, the more neglected, the more forgotten the population of actually living creatures in the world, the more we argue they have an absolute moral authority. The more they are suffered, the more they can't defend themselves, the more they have been preyed upon. Well, what demographic of human life in the last 50 years in America has been preyed upon more than the unborn? Who has died more? The killing fields of abortion clinics in America alone have offered up millions and tens and tens and tens of millions of slaughtered babies in that time. None of whom had a right to speak for themselves, none of whom had any defense or protection under the law, who were treated as just so much parasitical tissue, nothing else but a sneeze in some respects. It's highly, highly, highly problematic and incredibly different to square with the progressive agenda in terms of their own boastful compassion. That's why I think we have to redefine a baby into a fetus. That's why I think we have to dehumanize it. That's why I think we have to deflect the rights of the child by defaulting to the comforts or the career ambitions or even the simple choice capacities of the mother. And as we saw last year, one of those great quotes, last week, one of the great quotes that I showed you, the time for mother's choice is before the baby comes, is before the pregnancy. You have a whole bunch of choices you can make before that instance happens. And so if we move a little bit further, again, with Susan B. Anthony, begins with guilt, ends with criminality, and the whole text of her quote here is about responsibility and innocence and conscience and spiritual acknowledgement. If we move forward in our consideration of abortion in America, we move to the 1920s. All right, we saw the 19th century, even the suffragettes, even the emerging feminist movement really take a stand for life, right? You can ennoble the woman, you can provide equality to the woman, you can provide opportunity to the woman, you can do all that without compromising the rights of the life of the child. We get to the 1920s, and we know the 1920s is the era of the Gilded Age. We know it's an era of a rapidly changing sexual landscape. We know in many respects it is the beginning of the sexual revolution. If you think about how the images of women, the representations of women, how everything from jazz to music to dance changed, how swimsuits, if you look at swimsuits prior to the 1920s and then what you get in the 1920s, we see a very strong move towards a much relaxed sexuality. And it's not surprising that in the 1920s, as was going on all throughout Europe, you begin to have the nascent rise of fascism. It's interesting to me that the more we divorce ourselves from our Christian roots, the more we divorce ourselves from traditional values, traditional understandings of marriage in the early parts of the 20th century, that right alongside that regression of morality, that regression of religious and theological understandings, that commitment to life, what grows up alongside it? What seems to grow up alongside of that, almost going the opposite way, as the values and the traditional norms recede, what grows is an increasingly fascist aspect to every aspect of humanity. This idea that not just unborn babies, but all people can be expendable. whether they be Jews, whether they be Eastern Europeans or Slavs, whether they be lesbians and gay people. And again, you think about the kind of violence that lesbian and gay people have experienced over the course of the last few hundred years, and you see the compassion of the progressive left for them, and yet they did not experience anything like the kind of murder that we are inflicting on unborn babies. Yes, it's absolutely true that to be lesbian and gay was to end up in the concentration camps of Germany, or Japan for that matter, at the same rate that Jews did. But there was never that kind of focus, right? It was never something so culturally obvious that people couldn't find ways to evade it. But here you have it here. And in the 1920s, with this liberation of sexual mores, something really interesting and frustrating happened. We see in the 1920s it's the rise of birth control movement, headed by, among others, Margaret Sanger. This second generation, if you will, of suffragette-minded. Women had the right to vote by then, but women's rights, liberation-minded women like Margaret Sanger, they took a much different tack to abortion than their predecessors did. For them, and this is what's so interesting, that abortion became a logical outgrowth of contraception. Think about the way this works. You really couldn't have had legalized abortion in America, or really in any of the Western nations. You couldn't have had it until you first mainstreamed contraception. When we made contraception cheap and available, when we made it much more easy to use and easy to access, none of which, by the way, I would argue are necessarily bad things. But when we did that, along with the technology came a promise by technologists and scientists and health providers that now women can have sex without consequences. This is, of course, absurd. The idea that sex without consequences is of itself a higher good than the consequences of sex is biologically, let alone morally and spiritually dubious. This idea that in the recession of the family, in the recession of traditional marriage, in the recession, the depression, if you will, of traditional moral values when it came to life, when it came to children and families, that somehow the sexual act as an individual act was elevated above all of those things without any epistemological understanding of what the primary purpose was. In other words, sex for sex's sake came to be the mantra. And with all of this birth control that was being developed, again, not in itself a bad thing, but the premise of it was that you're entitled to sex without babies. And when that happened, and I think the Catholic Church made this point all throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the Catholic Church pointed out that if you start from that premise, that the primary purpose of sex is expression or love or marital bliss or pleasure, then by definition, and you made it easy, you facilitated the ability to have sex with greater and greater reduced possibilities of pregnancy, then you opened a can of worms. What happened when women did get pregnant? Because as we know to this day, highly sophisticated birth control doesn't always work. Condoms are oftentimes not enough to prevent pregnancy. There is seemingly loopholes and problems and blank spaces, if you will. With most modern methods of birth control, we have yet to develop a perfectly 100% guaranteed birth control for sexually active people. And because of that, you have already promised those people that sex doesn't have to mean anything. You've already promised them that there should be no consequences to sex. Then suddenly the technology fails and the questionable ethics are called to account. Well, then you can't undo the promise. Abortion had to become de facto contraception for people who were promised something else by their culture. People who felt that they could engage in sexuality, random sexuality, or even sexuality with their spouses, and be free from the consequence of childbirth. If that's the promise, then abortion would become that. It was not about destroying defective children primarily. It was not about those rare instances when you actually do have pregnancies derived from rape and incest, or even from the immediate physical danger to the life of the mother. Those weren't the primary reasons. This was simply abortion as after-the-fact contraception. And that's something to be very concerned about. That, again, after the moment of conception, after the consequences, the biological, natural consequences of sex kick in, well, then we have to go back and retroactively undo it. And that's the problem with what happened in the 1920s. We get the rise of birth control movement right about the time we were getting the rise of fascism, right about the time we were beginning to justify, in a kind of socially Darwinistic way, the murder of all sorts of innocents, right? Those who don't fit, those who are too poor or too sick, those who are too old, or culturally, right? This idea that we had to weed the races out, that there were some races that were nobler than others, that there were some races that promised greater efficacy and longevity and stability for the human race, and others, according to the scientists. Let's not let the scientists off the hook here. It's always amused me in a disturbing way that whenever anybody does something bad in the name of religion, whenever anybody does something bad in the name of religion, it is always for the progressive the fault of religion. The religion itself is, unless of course you're dealing with Islam, which is another one of these interesting quirks, right? You think about how sensitive the left is to almost every voiceless person except the most voiceless of all, the infant. And you think about the left's position with regards to religion. Bad things done in the name of religion, usually always for the left, is a condemnation of the religion. Certainly of Western religions like Judaism and Christianity. But when it comes to Islam, people acting badly in the name of Islam, and there's a good number of them, we can never associate those bad intentions with that particular religion. It's the same thing with the abortion debate, right? That the weakest among us, the most vulnerable, the most voiceless, the unborn, they don't qualify on our radar as actually being people, at least for the progressive left. And there you have that, again, the problem with abortion and why many feminists oppose abortion, why many of the leading early feminists opposed abortion, why this idea that you cannot be for all those other things and be so radically unconcerned with this and the consequences of this kind of practice. In the 1920s, we go back to our chart, the rise of birth control movement headed by Margaret Sanger, perhaps the most famous of the proponents, but she was also a proponent of eugenics, like so many people in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens, President of the United States, was a big eugenicist. Margaret Sanger was a huge eugenicist. She was somebody who believed in the power of birth control and abortion, yes, to empower women's choices, but also to eradicate and prohibit the birth of undesirables, primarily racial undesirables and mental and health undesirables. The sick, the weak, those who Christ most enjoined us to take care of. Christ argued that the greatest love was this kind of sacrificial love. Again, send you as sheep into a world of wolves. The job here is to love that way, love the sick and the weak and the helpless that way. The stronger we are, the more we are called to love in that sacrificial way. But along with all of this rose eugenics. And there were many, many Americans that have dabbled with this in the teens, in the 20s, and the 30s. That we never did have a full-fledged fascist movement in America. But what we did have was a lot of sympathizers to this argument that science now should help us weed out and eliminate the weaker races, the weaker species, so that there would be a greater productive reproduction system where only stronger genes and stronger cultures rose. If you actually look at what Margaret Sanger said, and these are some very famous statements, in an interview to the New York Times in 1923, she wrote, birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. That's an important sentence. Birth control is not indiscriminate and thoughtless. It has to have a teleology. Birth control has a purpose, and it is not first and foremost, or even primarily, to stop babies from being born. It is to stop certain kinds of babies being born. In the case of Margaret Sanger, black and brown skin babies, and babies that derived from other supposedly sick lineages. Birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It means the release and cultivation of the better racial elements in our society. Progressives, how do you parse this? And don't give me this garbage that she, however bad she was, and she didn't mean this, and she's taken out of context. This kind of language, in the words of any Southern person, in the word of any men, in the words of any Republican politician or conservative thinker, would doom them to the ash heap of history. There is no way you can bring Margaret Sanger back from this, and as if that was the only statement that she made. But you do. You pretend that the organization she founded, Planned Parenthood, which is really an abortion mill. The mammograms are farmed out, all this women's health stuff. You could take that $500 million a year that the taxpayers are forced to turn over to Planned Parenthood, and you could find much, much safer, cleaner, better ways. More direct ways without middlemen. In this instance, without the middle women of Planned Parenthood. It's interesting how midwifery gave way to middle womanhood in terms of facilitating these kinds of abortions. Instead of midwives, right, supplanting doctors, women trusted them more to bring babies into the world, healthier and safer, women understanding women's bodies. We have now mid-women whose job it is, middle women, to act as go-betweens between real women's health and the abortion services they steer women into. That money would be so much better served if you gave it directly to women's clinics that do mammograms and pap smears and help women with reproductive health when they are pregnant. How do you nurture and sustain the baby, rather than the abortion mills? And it's a consequence of I think a lot of it's a consequence of the eugenic mindedness of early abortion arguments. Finish the Margaret Sanger quote. Birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It means the release and cultivation of the better racial elements in our society, and by consequence, it means the gradual suppression, elimination, and extirpation. We are going to suppress the birth of undesirable races and defective races. We are going to eliminate them and eventually wipe them out entirely. And you see that happening today with Down syndrome babies. Down syndrome babies, to Margaret Sanger, are nothing but defective stock. They are imperfect humans, not worthy of life, and we're going to abort them. Even if there's only a 40% chance that you might get one, we're going to abort them. And countries like Iceland and Denmark and France boast and boast and boast how they are making great strides in the elimination of this defective stock. Take it further. Finish her quote. What does she call them? It's not enough to suppress, to eliminate, and wipe out the defective races. She calls them those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization. I guarantee you, if I put that quote, I simply referred to black and brown skin races as human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers in American civilization, and I asked you who said that, I guarantee you would have said David Duke, you would have said the Ku Klux Klan, you would have picked any number of famous races throughout American history. You would not have thought of the founder of Planned Parenthood. And if Robert E. Lee's statues have to come down, simply because he fought for the Confederacy, if all the Thomas Jefferson's monuments have to be splashed with blood because he was a slave owner, how do you justify the continued existence progressive left? How do you justify it? What that tells us is what we suggested earlier. This is not about morality for you. This is not about consistency. For this issue, you don't care less about social justice. You embrace antisocial injustice if it means the right to destroy life, in favor of sexual pleasure, in favor of career, in favor of, as Susan B. Anthony said, any kind of loose moral comforts. Finish the quote. Those human weeds, she calls them, which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of the American civilization. Another quote, go to the next one, another short quote from 1920 from Margaret Sanger, from her essay, Women in the New Race. Notice the title of the essay, Women, and how women are going to breed the new race of human beings who will be free from idiocy, free from disease, and free from those bothersome racial elements that make them undesirable. Woman and the new race. Very Hitlerian, isn't it? 13 years, I should say, before Hitler took power in Nazi Germany, you have these vile experimentations with eugenicist racist language. She says, quote, "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." Even Hitler didn't do that. Even Hitler encouraged big families in Germany. Now, of course, he recruited those born children into his armies. But it's odd to think that Hitler may have had been a little bit more forward-thinking on large families and many babies than Margaret Sanger was, the most merciful thing. And notice this twisting of language. Think about the moral clarity that we saw in Katie Stanton last week, or we saw in Susan B. Anthony this week. This is moral. It's a simple moral question, right? You separate the politics from this, it's killing a living thing for your own comfort. That's 99% of abortions right there. Look at how Margaret Sanger has already engaged in the kind of Orwellian doublespeak where black is white and truth is falsehood. She says the most merciful mercy. Mercy is to destroy otherwise healthy members of families who happen to have too many children. The merciful thing you can do to it is to kill it. It's Margaret Sanger in 1920. And if we jump ahead from there, it was a short time. I already explained this is what happened, right? When the primary right of sexuality was not to get pregnant. That sexuality had to be divorced from pregnancy, or else women were enslaved to some degree. Forget the fact that the vast majority of abortions were women who engaged in consensual sex, who chose to have sex. Nevertheless, we had to get to the point where we criminalized the child aspect of it, made it seem like it was some kind of an undue burden. By 1963, the Society for Human Abortion is established in San Francisco, and they went on a major crusade to rewrite the norms of abortion. The media, in other words, the media wing of left-wing atheistic propaganda, as it's been churning since the Bolshevik Revolution, continued to churn here. By 1965, this is really important. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protects the right to privacy, women's right to privacy. Interestingly, there is no such argument in the Constitution. Supreme Court justices teased it out of penumbras, shadows and umbrellas of meaning that aren't necessarily there, but that they have to be massaged and manipulated. And that's an important one, because when Roe versus Wade was going to be passed in 1973, just 8 short years after the reacting Griswold versus Connecticut, after that happened, it was going to be, ironically, not because the Supreme Court decided when a baby was a living thing, not because the Supreme Court understood the medical implications. In fact, the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade, 9 men, right, this always gets me too. I thought men weren't supposed to have any say in this. I thought men deciding the fate of women's bodies was a bad thing. Well, I'm being facetious here. As long as women side in favor of female emancipation, which to the modern progressive means the ability to destroy their children, well, then those men are okay. 9 men in Supreme Court robes who categorically admit in Roe versus Wade that they really don't know when life begins. Radically don't understand it. But for the sake of this new privacy, this new-found constitutional right to privacy, that was going to be the justification for legalizing abortion. When you think about how flimsy, how questionably legal, how straining all sorts of constitutional precedents this was to get there, they were really desperate to get there by hook or by crook. And Griswold in 65 was a necessary first step. By 1967, Colorado will be remembered as one of the first state to begin to liberalize abortion laws, just like it was the first state to legalize marijuana laws. 1969, abortionists, 2 men, Lader and Nathanson, found the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Law, NARAL, which is with us today. And what's interesting is that Nathanson, both male doctors, but Nathanson later backed away from NARAL and admitted publicly, Nathanson, that he made up statistics and made up horrifying cases that never really happened of women being raped, that never really happened to simply justify the creation of NARAL. We're going to find out, as you know, from Roe versus Wade, that the plaintiff, Roe, McCorvey completely recanted all of this. She became a devout Catholic later in life and argued that she was utterly manipulated by the lawyers who were simply trying to find a premise to pass abortion rights. McCorvey actually came forward and said that her pregnancy that triggered the Supreme Court case was the virtue of a rape, but she was never raped. She recanted that story. She wasn't raped, and her lawyers knew she wasn't raped. They just used the premise to force the case before the Supreme Court and to then pass abortion rights. 1970, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, and Washington. It makes perfect sense, right? Alaska perhaps is the standout. Hawaii, New York, and Washington make perfect sense. All you need in that list is Massachusetts to see how this goes in California. They repeal bans on abortion after viability only, right? and viability hadn't really been decided upon. As we'll see, the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade suggested that viability was sometime after the second trimester. But already here in 1970, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, Washington repeal bans on abortion after the baby is quote-unquote viable, which means a lot of things in a lot of different vocabularies. Making abortion available at the request of a woman and her doctor up to a full 24 weeks. 1971, I mentioned the Comstock Act. 1883, right? The Comstock Act, which prohibited advertisers to solicit abortion. All those provisions were stripped out of the Comstock Act. So abortion now became a hot-button political issue that could be lobbied and marketed to women on the basis of emancipation, on the basis that the child wasn't a living thing, on the basis of freedom and security and ERA and 1,000 other things. And then we get, finally, to Roe versus Wade, which will be in part what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about just what kind of bad law it was, what it was predicated on, how it had really the justices. Many people have called this the most oddly and foolishly written decision of any Supreme Court at any time. And I think we'll see next week why that is. But just before we go today, 1973, Roe versus Wade. I already mentioned to you how the plaintiff, Roe, was actually under false circumstances. She was not a victim of rape. She did not have to have that baby against her will. She was a willing participant in the sexual encounter that impregnated her, but her lawyers did it anyway. We'll push this to the max. The decision struck down all state laws making abortion illegal. And then what people don't realize, the very same day, in 73, Doe versus Bolton was passed. That was a companion to Roe versus Wade, and it made abortion on demand legal through all 9 months of pregnancy. And it did so by opening up the definition of woman's health to be pretty much anything a woman said she wanted to be healthy. And if that meant aborting her baby at 8.5 months, well, that's a health issue too now. And the whole world is spun on its ear. We'll see you next week. We're going to look more seriously at the litigation legacy of Roe versus Wade, how it was determined, and really the flimsy, the complete lack of actual constitutional engagement that the Supreme Court justices engaged in to come to that agreement, how absurd, hysterically so in some ways, that decision was from the perspective of law. And then we're going to look at the moral and ethical concerns of abortion in the modern world. So thanks for joining us. We will see you again next week.